The 5th annual Louisiana Book Festival attracted 15,000 participants to downtown Baton Rouge and represented over 100 authors. Join us as we celebrate readers, writers, and their books with highlights from the 2007 Louisiana Book Festival. From the Capitol Building to the State Library, the festival is packed with activities for all ages and interests. Among the wide assortment of programs, several panel discussions allow authors to address common topics. We'll begin with Katrina and the Politics of Disaster, Before and After. The Pulitzer Prize-winning Metro editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, Jed Horne, has written a scathing account of the mayhem surrounding the storm in his book, Breach of Faith, Hurricane Katrina and the Near Death of a Great American City. Ivor van Heerden, co-founder and director of the LSU Hurricane Center, wrote The Storm, What Went Wrong and Why During Hurricane Katrina, the inside story from one Louisiana scientist. Van Heerden holds a Ph.D. in marine sciences from LSU and is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering. Beth Courtney from Louisiana Public Broadcasting moderates.
We're so pleased to have you here, and the topic is indeed a serious one, and we have some outstanding authors with us. We were discussing earlier how it's been 2 years, but for all of us in Louisiana, it still feels like we're not after the storm. We're still going through the storm. I was remembering at Louisiana Public Broadcasting where we had, at one moment in time, we were at the epicenter of all news in the world, I think. We had 300 reporters from NBC, CBS, Public Television, Public Radio, Entertainment Tonight, Croatian television, you name it, there. We were sending out stories 24 hours a day on every channel, streaming them. We had a sense of we were at a momentous time. But I, of course, did not have the sense to be taking notes, as these gentlemen did, obviously, and they're both wonderful writers. They were there at the moment of the storms, preceding the storms, and now have been following it after the storms, and we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say with us today. Jed Horne is the author of Breach of Faith, Hurricane Katrina and Near Death, and the Near Death of a Great American City. Jed is a native of Massachusetts, but he's been in New Orleans a long time. He moved to New Orleans in the late 80s with his wife and 2 sons, and except for the early 90s when he was posted to Latin America as a foreign correspondent for the Times-Picayune, he's worked for the paper as city editor and more recently Metro editor. And of course, he was part of the team that did win the Pulitzer Prize for their work covering the storm. Now, Ivor van Heerden, Ivor, I hope I pronounced it correctly, is certainly familiar with all of us in the media and public broadcasting because he's been on so many shows. I think he's a star of Nova these days. He's been on so many of our nature and science programs. He is the deputy director of the Louisiana State University Hurricane Center. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of Public Health Impacts of Hurricanes. And his book, The Storm, is certainly a very powerful tale from one scientist, as he says. He was born in South Africa, and he created hurricane modeling programs at LSU. He has had some controversy in his predictions, but I would say for all of us, we want to hear what they have to say, and I want you to be part of the conversation too. So I'm not going to only ask all the questions. I'm counting on you all to do that as well. But I thought we'd start out by saying to each of them, why did they feel it was important to write a book about this experience? So, Jed, to you.
We're glad that you're here. I want to join Beth in saying that. It really honors the post-Katrina world that your interest continues at a time when I think a lot of people are trying to just sort of forget the city that CARE forgot, but Katrina didn't. The problems are acute. They are long-lasting. We knew they would be, and unfortunately there are people in positions of considerable authority in this country who would like to pretend it's all over. To get at the question that Beth has posed, I actually didn't initially feel that it was important to write about Katrina. I thought it would be impossible to write about Katrina in anything like the time frame that was being suggested by Random House after they called me up, and I said, forget it. We're trying to salvage our lives down here. We're trying to put our roofs back on. We're trying to, help friends of ours who are homeless and keep the newspaper coming out and all that good stuff, call me in a couple of years. What changed my attitude was really two things, I would say. One was the sense, vague in my case, far more acute in the case of the Ivor van Heerdens of the world, and we'll hear from Ivor more directly about the science here, but the sense that there was enormous amounts of misinformation, lies in some cases, bigotry, all manner of superstition was being fobbed off as news and being passed around the world. A lot of it horribly negative, invidious to the city's reputation, and in that way hurtful of its chances of survival. And the journalist in me, that kind of got my juices flowing, and I began wanting to understand and correct some of that garbage that was passed off as news. The metaphor for what was going on in the information cycle really was the metaphor, the most useful one is that of a hurricane itself. A hurricane sucks water up into this enormous vacuum created by whirling winds and rolls it up onto land with disastrous results, as Mississippi learned very directly, and we learned indirectly in New Orleans. The information age metaphor that occurs when there is a collapse of the communications infrastructure is quite similar. In that vacuum is drawn all manner of retrograde kinds of thinking, superstition. It's the return of the repressed, as the Freudians in the room will understand the term. And that's the garbage that needed to be dealt with and dismantled and understood. There was a second motive in my case for wanting to get into the story, and what I wound up writing was a sort of a braided narrative that I think, without any offense to me, can be called a melodrama. It is a soap opera. It is structured like a good soap in the sense that narratives are picked up, threads are followed, threads are abandoned and later returned to the weave and are put back into play as part of the story. And as a journalist, hearing and seeing, in my capacity then as city editor, the extraordinary tales of heroism, of villainy, of suffering, of relief and elation. I mean, it was more than I had ever experienced, and I had covered, some war situations and other extreme kinds of human events. I really wanted to get into the heads of those people. I think we all had kind of a helicopter pilot's eye view from watching on television in those early days, the folks getting plucked up off the roof. I wanted to know what it was like to be this Katrina Peters, to name one character that I deal with at some length, to be on the roof as the whole house begins to float away to what she is certain will be her death, and she's there clutching at her daughter. Beyond that, I wanted to know, and I felt we had heard a lot about the poor and the people who were kind of in harm's way and couldn't get out of harm's way, although Katrina had a choice, which was an important sort of inflection on her experience. I also wanted to know what it was like for the rich and for the powerful. Spent time with Governor Blanco in this very building and came to appreciate the very different experience, not less intense, not less stressful, and in some ways equally surreal that she was going through, and others all up and down the socioeconomic ladder. Ivor was good enough to share some of his experiences with me, told far more fully in his own book, but he was a man and a scientist and an expert who went through an extraordinary kind of ordeal in the course of battling against the mistruths about Katrina. I'll stop with that, but thank you all for being here.
Ivor.
And I appreciate being invited here. I couldn't make it last year because I'd been sucked off to some other book fair. But I think what one of the triggers for me was in the mid-1990s, I'd been asked by the then Governor Edwards, who I have to acknowledge I didn't know from a bar of soap, but I was asked to run the Coastal Restoration Program, and the reason being they were about to lose the QWPRA, the Coastal Wetlands Planning Protection Restoration Act, federal dollars, because the General Accounting Office had determined that the program at that point was nothing but pet drainage projects for state legislators. So they brought me in, and we made a lot of changes. We tried to get the program focused on big projects, on going out and mining sand and rebuilding barrier islands, getting river diversions going. And especially the barrier islands, we thought we had all our ducks in the road. We had secured federal dollars. We had secured the Mineral Management Service rights to mine. We had letters from all our congressional delegation. And when we left, when Governor Foster took over, we thought, they're going to go ahead and restore the barrier islands. And within 2 months, they dismantled the project and walked away from $200 million. And so as a scientist, I said to myself, well, we're not going to restore this coast before we get a major hurricane. So what's the next best thing to do? And that is, let's go find out about hurricanes. And, I met Mark Levitan, who was then had an idea of setting up a hurricane center. I had a similar idea. And eventually we got the funding, we got permission from LSU to set up a hurricane center. And that opened the door to then go and get funding to start focusing on New Orleans. And through a competitive grant from the Board of Regents, we got funding, 5 years of funding, to put a team of 16 scientists together, ranging from engineers to medical doctors, toxicologists, veterinarians, you name it. And we started to focus on New Orleans. So when the storm arrived, we had a pretty thorough understanding of what could go wrong. When we realized on late Tuesday, landfall being on Monday morning, that the city was underwater. And from the video, we realized that this city had a whole lot more water in it than the one breach the Corps of Engineers was talking about. And that was the 17th Street breach. And also from our computer models, we knew that the water hadn't got high enough in Lake Pontchartrain for the 17th Street to have breached as an act of God. So I went to the governor's office Tuesday night and I said, there's something wrong with this picture, and they said, go find out. And so very shortly we got an aeroplane. I took my own motorboat and crossed Lake Pontchartrain and got into the city that way. And we realized very quickly that there was 28 breaches that we could count. And we couldn't fly the whole system. And of course, you couldn't help but see the people on the roofs and so on. But we assumed that the federal government, because we'd done this exercise, Hurricane Pam, a year before, would really move in and everything would be fine. And then we watched the wheels come off. And so part of what drove me was we had been fortunate enough to get the funding. We had a very thorough understanding of the science. We had acquired and developed a storm surge model that allows very accurate predictions. We had warned starting on Saturday night that New Orleans would flood from overtopping. We had warned that the water would be at the tops of the levees and there probably would be failures. And then we watched in absolute dismay as the government didn't respond. And these people had to sit around and hang on roofs and so on for a week. We now know that half the people who died during Katrina, half of the 1,600, died from the failed response. 800 died from the actual flooding. So it was through indignation that, hang on, man, we've got all this wonderful science. We've done a lot. We've been warning. For years, I've taken every opportunity I could to get on TV or in the media and say it's going to happen, and it was ignored. And then I think what also fired me up was, here was the federal government not owning up to the fact that it was its levies. And then, right in the middle of this, the former House Speaker in the Congress, Dennis Hastert, came up and said, well, we shouldn't rebuild New Orleans. So I felt we needed to get a book out there that showed you ignore science at your peril, that really got the truth out about what had happened. Because overnight, 150,000 families lost everything. Lost their homes, their possessions, their jobs, and so they needed to be compensated. And then the other important thing was to counteract this concept that you can't rebuild New Orleans. You know, you guys shouldn't have lived there. It's below sea level. And having been to the Netherlands, I knew that we could quite easily survive in New Orleans if we did it properly. So that's what drove me to write that book. But I realized that I didn't have the time to write everything, to do all the research that was necessary. And I was very fortunate in this was a book that was written before we actually had a contract. That's how quickly it went. But I was very fortunate that the editor at Penguin knew Mike Bryan, and he stepped into our lives, and the book resulted. And you know, my hope is that somewhere along the way, the book makes a difference, and that we finally get the attention that we deserve here in Louisiana.
Well, speaking of attention, every hurricane season, I know it's obligatory in every newsroom, you do it's hurricane season, how do you prepare, what do you do? And we've been doing the obligatory stories saying, and it's below sea level, New Orleans, you need to evacuate, you need to do certain things.
Only half.
Parts of it below sea level. But it's the obligatory story. Everyone would do it. I said for years my husband was always covering hurricanes, but we'd always say the big one may be coming. It's not, and you had scientific projections. We were involved in the planning exercise.